In the heart of Texas, on the outskirts of a small town known as Hearne, a prisoner of war camp housed German soldiers captured during World War II. Officially designated Camp Hearne, this facility operated under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General. Established in 1943, the camp was designed to accommodate approximately 4,800 prisoners and was part of a network of over 500 POW camps across the United States, established to detain the German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers captured during the conflict. Camp Hearne was laid out according to standard military specifications. It consisted of several compounds, each surrounded by barbed wire fencing and guard towers manned by units from the military police. The camp featured barracks, administrative buildings, a mess hall, a hospital, and recreational facilities, including a library and a theater. The guards, primarily from the 304th Military Police Battalion, were tasked with maintaining order and security while adhering to the Geneva Conventions, which dictated the treatment of prisoners of war. The prisoners at Camp Hearne were engaged in various labor activities, which were essential both for the camp's self-sufficiency and for supporting the local economy. According to War Department circulars and labor contracts archived in the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General records, prisoners worked in agriculture, canneries, and lumber yards. They also contributed to the maintenance of railroads and were employed in local grocery stores and factories. The prisoners' labor was crucial in offsetting the labor shortages experienced by the United States during wartime. Prisoners were compensated for their work with a nominal wage, as stipulated by the Geneva Conventions. They received a small allowance in the form of coupons or scrip, which could be used to purchase items at the camp canteen. The prisoners had access to a variety of goods, albeit limited by wartime rationing policies. Food systems within the camp were designed to provide a balanced diet, although shortages and substitutions were not uncommon due to the global conflict. The presence of German prisoners in Texas, while a source of curiosity, was generally accepted by the local civilian population. Red Cross inspection reports and camp newspapers indicate that there were few recorded incidents of hostility. On the contrary, some local communities benefited from the prisoners' labor, which helped sustain agricultural production and other essential services during the war. The camp was not isolated from the outside world, as evidenced by the transportation logs detailing the movement of goods and personnel in and out of the facility. Moreover, prisoners were allowed to send and receive mail, though it was subject to censorship. Educational programs, often organized by the YMCA, provided opportunities for prisoners to learn English and other subjects. These programs were part of a broader effort to promote constructive engagement among the prisoners and to prepare them for a post-war world. The ideological climate within Camp Hearne was complex. Despite the structured environment, the prisoners were exposed to the democratic principles that governed their captors. One of the most striking examples of this was the political broadcasts that could be heard on radios within the camp. These broadcasts often featured journalists openly criticizing U.S. military decisions, war logistics, and even President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. This unfettered criticism was a stark contrast to the tightly controlled propaganda disseminated in Nazi Germany. German officers within the camp, some of whom had been involved in the Nazi propaganda efforts, were initially skeptical of these broadcasts. They anticipated some form of backlash, perhaps censorship, arrests, or the shutdown of the station. However, as time passed, it became evident that such actions were not forthcoming. The broadcasts continued, and the camp newspapers even published political cartoons and caricatures that lampooned government figures. Among the prisoners, there was a former Nazi propagandist who attempted to convince others that the political broadcasts were staged. However, a camp barber who had worked in several towns across Texas offered a different perspective. He informed his fellow prisoners that such open criticism was a normal aspect of American life, even during wartime. This revelation was corroborated by Red Cross inspection reports, which noted the relative freedom of expression allowed within the camp. Camp discipline was maintained through a combination of military protocol and respect for the prisoners' rights under international law. Medical access was available to all prisoners, with a hospital facility staffed by qualified personnel. The health care services were inspected regularly by the Red Cross to ensure compliance with the Geneva Conventions. As the war drew to a close, attention turned to the repatriation of prisoners. Post-war repatriation directives outlined the procedures for returning prisoners to their home countries. These directives also included re-education programs aimed at dismantling the ideological indoctrination of Nazi Germany. These programs did not rely on coercion, but rather sought to expose prisoners to democratic values through the very systems and environments they experienced in captivity. Through the lens of Camp Hearne, the German officers and soldiers witnessed an ideological dismantling that was subtle yet profound. The power structures in America, far from fearing their citizens, allowed and even encouraged open discourse and criticism. This exposure to democratic principles and practices, even within the confines of a prisoner of war camp, planted seeds of doubt about the totalitarian regime they had once served. The story of Camp Hearne is not just a chapter in the history of World War II, but also a testament to the resilience and adaptability of democratic ideals in the face of global conflict. Amid the regimented life within Camp Hearne, the German officers found themselves in an environment that was both familiar and perplexing. The camp, situated on a sprawling plot of land in Texas, was a striking example of military precision, with its orderly rows of barracks, towering guard towers, and various recreational facilities. It was as if someone had taken a slice of the battlefield's structured chaos and transplanted it into the calm of the American countryside, creating a microcosm of military life. The operation of the camp adhered strictly to the Geneva Conventions, a fact that both surprised and reassured the prisoners. Their basic needs were met. They were provided with food, shelter, and medical care, and were treated humanely, a stark contrast to the harsh conditions they had heard about in other POW camps around the world. The prisoners were engaged in daily labor, which was not just a means of keeping them occupied, but also a significant contributor to the local economy. They worked in agriculture, helping to harvest crops and tend to livestock, and in other essential industries that had been depleted by the absence of American men who had gone off to fight. For their labor, the prisoners received nominal wages, which, while modest, were a token of their contribution to the community. They could spend their earnings at the camp canteen, purchasing small luxuries that brought a sense of normalcy to their confined lives, or save them for their eventual repatriation, a hope that grew more tangible with each passing day. However, it was the exposure to American political broadcasts that truly captured the officers' attention and sparked their intellectual curiosity. These broadcasts, transmitted over the camp's radio system, had become a staple of the prisoners' routine, a window into the world outside their barbed wire enclosure. The broadcasts were unlike anything the officers had experienced before. Journalists spoke freely, criticizing military decisions, war logistics, and even the president himself. This was a stark contrast to the controlled messages they had been accustomed to under the Nazi regime, where propaganda was meticulously curated and any dissent was swiftly silenced. The German officers, particularly those with backgrounds in intelligence and propaganda, initially anticipated a swift crackdown on such open dissent. They waited for the other shoe to drop, for the American government to silence these voices of criticism. Yet no such action occurred, and the broadcasts continued unabated, much to their astonishment. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the officers' initial skepticism gradually gave way to a deeper curiosity. They began to question their previous assumptions, realizing that perhaps there was more to the American system than they had been led to believe. The camp barber, a gregarious man who had lived in various parts of Texas before the war, became an unexpected source of insight for them. During haircuts, as the officers sat in the barber's chair and watched their reflections become sharper with each stroke of the razor, the barber recounted stories of towns where political discourse was a common part of public life, even in times of war. He spoke of community gatherings where citizens passionately debated government policies and military strategies, of town hall meetings where criticism was not only allowed but encouraged. This normalization of criticism and debate was baffling to those who had been indoctrinated in a system where dissent was met with severe punishment. Among the officers, Oberleutnant Karl Müller, a former Nazi propagandist, was particularly vocal in his disbelief. He was a man who had spent years crafting messages that glorified the Reich and vilified its enemies, and he found it difficult to reconcile the freedom of speech he was witnessing with his understanding of how a government should operate. Müller posited that the broadcasts were a ruse, a carefully orchestrated facade meant to sow confusion and discord among the prisoners. He argued that the true nature of American power was hidden behind this illusory freedom, that it was a clever tactic to weaken their resolve and loyalty to the fatherland. However, as time passed and the anticipated crackdown never materialized, Müller found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the American system was not as fragile or deceptive as he had believed. The officers began to observe the American guards and the local civilians with a newfound interest and a more open mind. The guards, while maintaining discipline and order within the camp, often engaged in casual conversations with the prisoners, discussing everything from the latest baseball game to the intricacies of American politics. This openness was mirrored in the interactions with civilians who occasionally visited the camp, whether to deliver supplies or simply out of curiosity. These interactions were conducted under the watchful eyes of the camp's administration, but were characterized by a respectful exchange of ideas. It was as if the Americans were extending an olive branch, showing the prisoners a different way of life through their actions rather than through force. The camp's library, stocked with local newspapers and books, further reinforced the officers' observations. They pored over articles that featured caricatures of political figures, critiques of government policies, and debates over war strategy. This freedom of the press, a cornerstone of American democracy, was both perplexing and enlightening to the prisoners. They noted that such discourse did not lead to arrests or censorship, but rather seemed to be an accepted part of American life. The newspapers were not tools of propaganda, but rather platforms for public discourse, a concept that was both foreign and fascinating to the officers. The camp's educational programs also played a significant role in exposing the prisoners to democratic ideals. Classes on American history and government were offered, and while attendance was voluntary, they were well attended. These classes were designed not only to educate, but also to promote critical thinking and open dialogue. The officers noted that these programs, combined with the political broadcasts and open discussions, created an environment where questioning authority was not only permitted, but encouraged. The classes covered topics such as the American Revolution, the drafting of the Constitution, and the Civil War, illustrating how the United States had grappled with its own struggles for freedom and unity. The officers found themselves in a paradox. They were learning about a system they had been trained to oppose, yet they couldn't help but be intrigued by its resilience and adaptability. As the war progressed and the tide turned against Germany, the officers received intermittent updates on the state of the conflict. These updates, while often limited in detail, painted a picture of a nation struggling under the weight of its own ambitions, a once mighty force now facing the repercussions of its expansionist policies. The contrast between the dire reports from Europe and the seemingly stable and open society in America was not lost on them. The officers began to discuss among themselves the possibility that the ideological foundation they had been taught to uphold was not as infallible as they had believed. The seeds of doubt, once sown, began to take root. The camp administration, aware of the potential for unrest, monitored these discussions but refrained from interfering. The commandant, a pragmatic officer, understood that the exposure to American values was part of a broader strategy to undermine totalitarian ideologies. He believed that allowing the prisoners to witness firsthand the functioning of a democratic society would have a more profound impact than any direct attempt at indoctrination. He saw the prisoners not as enemies, but as individuals capable of change, capable of understanding the benefits of a system that valued freedom and individual rights. As repatriation efforts began to take shape, the officers found themselves at a crossroads. The re-education programs, designed to prepare them for life in post-war Germany, emphasized the importance of democratic principles and the rule of law. These programs were met with varying degrees of resistance and acceptance among the prisoners. Some, like Mueller, remained steadfast in their beliefs, viewing the programs as yet another attempt at manipulation. They clung to the ideologies of their past, unwilling or unable to let go of the certainty that had once guided them. Others, however, began to entertain the idea that there might be merit in the principles they had been exposed to. They saw in democracy not a threat, but an opportunity, a chance to rebuild their lives and their nation on a foundation of openness and equality. The long-term effects of this exposure would remain a subject of speculation. Some prisoners, upon returning to Germany, would carry with them the seeds of doubt sown during their time in captivity. They would return to a country in ruins, a country in need of rebuilding, not just physically, but ideologically. The experiences at Camp Hearne would serve as a reminder that there was another way, a way that did not rely on fear and oppression, but on dialogue and understanding. Others would remain unchanged, clinging to the ideologies of their past, unwilling to accept the possibility that they had been wrong. The officers, for their part, left Camp Hearne with a complex mixture of skepticism and newfound understanding. They had witnessed a system that did not fear criticism, a government that tolerated dissent, and a society that embraced debate. The story of Camp Hearne would become a footnote in the larger narrative of World War II, overshadowed by the monumental events that unfolded across the globe. Yet, for those who lived it, the experience was a profound reminder of the power of ideas and the resilience of human curiosity in the face of authoritarianism. It was a testament to the fact that even in the most unlikely of places, change was possible, and understanding could bridge even the widest of ideological divides. The atmosphere within Camp Hearne was a complex tapestry of contrasts and contradictions, a microcosm of cultural and ideological exchange during a tumultuous period in history. This camp, nestled in the heart of Texas, was a place where worlds collided, where German officers, accustomed to the rigid hierarchies and pervasive censorship of Nazi Germany, found themselves immersed in an environment that was as alien as it was enlightening. Here, in this unlikely setting, open criticism of the government was not just permitted, but seemingly encouraged, a stark departure from the oppressive regime they had known. The American Guards, predominantly young men hailing from a myriad of backgrounds across the United States, conducted their duties with an air of casual authority that was both perplexing and intriguing to the German prisoners. Unlike the draconian measures and overt displays of power they were used to, the guards at Camp Hearne maintained order through a subtler, more nuanced approach. This approach, rooted in mutual respect rather than intimidation, was emblematic of a democratic society where power dynamics were more fluid and less oppressive than the authoritarian structures of Nazi Germany. Among the prisoners was Oberleutnant Karl Müller, a man whose background in propaganda had finally attuned him to the nuances and potential influences of mass communication. Initially, Müller approached the camp's broadcasts with skepticism, suspecting them to be yet another layer of psychological warfare. However, as time passed, this skepticism gave way to a begrudging acknowledgement of their authenticity. The radio programs, unlike anything he had encountered under the Nazi regime, were punctuated by spirited debates and critical analyses of military strategies and political decisions. They were a revelation to Müller and others, like him, accustomed to a media landscape where dissent was swiftly and brutally suppressed. The absence of repercussions for the broadcasters was equally bewildering to Müller and his fellow officers. In Nazi Germany, such open criticism would have been met with severe consequences, yet here it was a normal part of daily life. This freedom of expression was one of the fundamental aspects of American democracy that the prisoners found both confounding and fascinating. It was a concept that challenged their preconceived notions of governance and control, prompting them to reevaluate the values they had been indoctrinated with. Central to this ideological exposure was the camp's library, a veritable treasure trove of knowledge and ideas. Stocked with a diverse array of books, from classic literature to contemporary political treatises, the library offered prisoners a window into the intellectual currents shaping the world beyond the barbed wire. Here, they encountered works by authors banned in Germany, exposing them to alternative perspectives on governance, freedom, and human rights. These texts sparked lively discussions among the prisoners, who eagerly compared them to the state-sanctioned literature they had consumed back home. For many, it was a first glimpse into a world where ideas were not just tools of propaganda, but vehicles for genuine understanding and growth. An unlikely but significant conduit of information was the camp barber, a civilian contractor who had worked in several Texas towns before the war. His interactions with the prisoners, though informal, were profoundly enlightening. As he trimmed hair and shaved beards, he spoke candidly about his experiences and the nature of American democracy. His stories, filled with anecdotes about town hall meetings, elections, and civic engagement, painted a vivid picture of a society fundamentally different from the authoritarian structure that the German officers were accustomed to. In his tales, the barber emphasized the importance of freedom of expression and the role of the press in holding the government accountable, concepts that resonated deeply with the prisoners, challenging their understanding of governance and personal freedom. Meanwhile, the camp's educational programs were integral to the U.S. government's broader strategy to re-educate prisoners of war. These programs aimed to instill democratic values and critical thinking skills, offering courses that covered a wide range of subjects, including English language, American history, and the principles of democracy. The instructors, often academics or professionals from nearby universities, fostered an environment where questioning and analysis were not just encouraged, but celebrated. Open discussion and debate were the norm, and prisoners were urged to engage with the material critically, challenging assumptions and exploring new ideas. Complementing these academic pursuits were the camp's recreational activities, which included sports competitions, theatrical performances, and musical concerts. These events provided opportunities for prisoners to interact with guards and civilians, further exposing them to American cultural norms and values. The camaraderie and mutual respect demonstrated during these activities stood in stark contrast to the rigid, hierarchical interactions they experienced in Germany. Through these shared experiences, prisoners began to see the potential for a society built on cooperation and mutual respect rather than fear and domination. As the war drew to a close, the impending repatriation process loomed large in the minds of the prisoners. The uncertainty about their future in a post-war Germany, coupled with the ideological exposure they had experienced at Camp Hearne, left many grappling with conflicting emotions. While some remained steadfast in their beliefs, others began to question the tenets of Nazism, recognizing the potential for a different kind of society, one where individual freedoms were respected and democratic principles prevailed. The Red Cross inspection reports from this period noted the unique atmosphere within the camp, highlighting the role of uncensored media and educational initiatives in shaping the prisoners' experiences. These reports, circulated among Allied and neutral nations, underscored the success of the American approach in promoting democratic ideals through engagement rather than coercion. They detailed the transformative impact that exposure to alternative ideas and systems had on the prisoners, providing a powerful testament to the efficacy of soft power in ideological re-education. The long-term impact of this exposure on individual prisoners remained an open question. Historical records indicate that a significant number of former POWs returned to Germany with altered perspectives, contributing to the post-war democratic reconstruction efforts. However, the extent to which these changes were internalized varied widely, influenced by personal experiences, pre-war beliefs, and the socio-political context they encountered upon returning home. Some embraced the democratic ideals they had been exposed to, while others remained skeptical, their beliefs tempered by years of indoctrination and war. In the years following the war, some of the German officers who had been detained at Camp Hearne reflected on their time there in memoirs and interviews. They acknowledged the cognitive dissonance they experienced, grappling with the realization that the American system, despite its flaws, allowed for a degree of personal freedom and accountability that was absent in Nazi Germany. These reflections offered valuable insights into the complex process of ideological transformation, illustrating the potential for change even among those deeply entrenched in authoritarian belief systems. Camp Hearne's legacy as a site of ideological confrontation and transformation endures, serving as a testament to the power of democratic principles in challenging and reshaping authoritarian ideologies. The story of the camp, with its unique approach to prisoner re-education, continues to resonate as a historical example of how exposure to alternative ideas and systems can plant the seeds of change, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. It reminds us of the enduring power of open dialogue, education, and cultural exchange in bridging divides and fostering understanding, a legacy that continues to inspire efforts toward reconciliation and peace in our world today. As the Allied forces advanced across the European theater during World War II, bringing liberation and hope to war-torn lands, the atmosphere within Camp Hearne, a prisoner of war camp located in Texas, began to shift in subtle yet significant ways. This camp, which had intriguingly evolved into a microcosm of democracy's resilience and adaptability, continued to function under the same democratic principles that had initially perplexed and even confounded its German occupants. The prisoners of war, particularly the officers among them, remained deeply engaged with the broadcasts and publications that freely critiqued American leadership, military strategies, and policies. This exposure to open debate and criticism was a stark contrast to their past experiences in Nazi Germany, where the environment was tightly controlled and dominated by propaganda. The camp's infrastructure, in strict adherence to the Geneva Conventions, provided for the basic needs of the prisoners. However, more importantly, it also facilitated an environment ripe for intellectual engagement and exploration. Educational programs became a defining feature of life at Camp Hearne, offering courses on a wide array of subjects, including American history, political systems, and English language lessons. These programs were not merely academic exercises, but were thoughtfully designed to prepare the prisoners for eventual repatriation. They aimed to foster a broader understanding of democratic processes and principles, encouraging the prisoners to consider perspectives that were vastly different from those they had been indoctrinated with under the Nazi regime. Among the German officers, many of whom had initially dismissed the broadcasts and publications as staged propaganda, there began a gradual reassessment of their assumptions. This reevaluation was not an instantaneous revelation, but rather a slow, evolving process. It developed over time as they observed the consistency with which American society tolerated dissent and embraced open discourse. The German officers noted with growing curiosity and interest that despite the critical nature of the discussions and the sometimes scathing critiques of leadership, there were no repercussions for those involved. This realization was further reinforced by the presence of American newspapers in the camp library, which regularly featured editorial cartoons lampooning public figures and government policies with a freedom that was unimaginable in Nazi Germany. A particularly intriguing figure in this subtle transformation was the camp's barber, who had previously explained to the prisoners the normalcy of such freedoms in America. The barber became an informal conduit of information, sharing insights gleaned from his interactions with townsfolk and soldiers. These interactions provided the prisoners with a broader understanding of the local population's perspectives on governance and civic rights. The exposure to these ideas contributed to a growing skepticism among some German officers regarding the infallibility of authoritarian rule, prompting lively discussions about the potential benefits and drawbacks of democratic governance. As the war neared its inevitable conclusion, the War Department outlined comprehensive plans for the repatriation of prisoners. These plans included re-education programs specifically designed to mitigate the influence of Nazi ideology. The programs emphasized core democratic values, the rule of law, and the importance of individual rights and freedoms. While some prisoners were receptive to these teachings, others remained wary and skeptical, viewing them as an extension of Allied propaganda efforts. However, the very fact that such programs were implemented underscored the Allies' unwavering commitment to promoting democratic ideals, even amidst the uncertainties of wartime. In addition to educational programs, the camp facilitated labor assignments for prisoners, allowing them to work on local farms and in various industries. This labor not only contributed significantly to the wartime economy, but also provided the POWs with invaluable opportunities to engage with American civilians. Through these interactions, prisoners encountered a rich and diverse spectrum of opinions and attitudes, further complicating their understanding of American society. The open exchange of ideas, whether over a shared task or during a brief respite, served to underscore the pluralistic and multifaceted nature of democracy. Red Cross inspection reports from this period noted the generally humane conditions within Camp Hearne, highlighting its strict adherence to international standards for the treatment of prisoners. These reports were not only circulated among POW camps globally, but also served as a testament to the democratic values of transparency and accountability. The inspection reports reinforced the notion that even in a time of war, democratic societies could uphold principles of fairness and justice. This transparency and accountability intrigued the German officers, who were more accustomed to a culture of secrecy and control under the Nazi regime. As the camp prepared for the eventual departure of its occupants, the ideological impact of their stay remained an open and intriguing question. While some prisoners openly questioned the tenets of totalitarianism they had once embraced, others retained their allegiance to the regime they had served. The complexity of human belief systems meant that the seeds of doubt and questioning planted by exposure to democratic practices might only bear fruit over time, perhaps influencing the prisoners' post-war lives and decisions in subtle yet profound ways. The broader implications of Camp Hearne's operations during World War II reflect a significant and often overlooked chapter in the history of prisoner of war camps. By maintaining a steadfast commitment to democratic principles and fostering an environment of intellectual engagement and open discourse, the camp demonstrated the potential for ideological transformation. The extent to which this transformation took hold varied among individuals, yet the very existence of such a space stands as a testament to the resilience of democratic ideals in the face of totalitarian opposition and adversity. As the officers eventually returned to a defeated and war-ravaged Germany, they carried with them the memory of their time in Camp Hearne, the experiences they had, the debates they witnessed, and the freedom of speech they encountered would serve as a counterpoint to their previous experiences under Nazi rule. Whether or not these memories would lead to a change in perspective or action was a question left to history. However, the camp's role in challenging the monolithic narratives of authoritarian regimes serves as an enduring example of the power of ideas, even amidst the darkest chapters of human conflict. In the end, Camp Hearne was more than just a prisoner of war camp. It was a microcosm of democratic resilience, a place where the seeds of doubt and questioning were sown, and a testament to the enduring power of democratic ideals. As the war concluded and the prisoners of Camp Hearne were repatriated, the camp's role in shaping the ideological landscape of its German occupants became clearer. Official records from the U.S. Army and Red Cross inspection reports detail the orderly process of repatriation, which began in earnest in 1945. The prisoners, having been exposed to a democratic system that allowed for open criticism and debate, returned to a Germany that was undergoing its own transformation from a totalitarian regime to a democratic state. Upon their return, many former prisoners found themselves in a nation grappling with the consequences of war and the need for reconstruction. Historical accounts and post-war surveys indicate that some of these individuals played a role in advocating for democratic principles and contributing to the rebuilding efforts. They brought with them the experiences and insights gained during their time at Camp Hearne, where they had observed a system that valued freedom of expression and individual rights. The camp itself was dismantled following the end of the war, its structures repurposed or removed as part of the post-war demobilization effort. Archival photographs and government documents from the period illustrate the transition of the site from a bustling military operation to a quiet landscape, reclaimed by the Texas countryside. The impact of the camp, however, lingered in the memories of those who had been held there, and in the broader narrative of POW experiences during World War II. As historians and scholars reflect on the legacy of Camp Hearne, it serves as a poignant example of how environments and systems can facilitate ideological change. The camp's adherence to democratic values, even in the midst of global conflict, demonstrated the potential for these principles to influence individuals from diverse and even opposing backgrounds. The story of Camp Hearne is a testament to the enduring power of open dialogue and education in fostering understanding and challenging authoritarian ideologies.